All right, welcome back, everyone. It's good to be with you tonight, and looking forward to the conversation this evening, focusing on human dignity and rights and responsibilities. Out of curiosity, any lasting impressions from our conversation last week on kind of the overview of the historical roots and key themes of Catholic social teaching? Anything that stands out to you, or that you've been thinking more about, or wondering about, something that maybe we didn't get to address or moved too quickly past? Feel free to use the chat feature if you'd like, if there's something you'd like to add. Or to any of my panelists, if there's something you want to share, it'd be great to hear from you.
Just one thing. After your class, I was involved in a Zoom meeting for the Synod. And of course, a lot of people have a lot of negative things to say about the church. And one of the things that I was thinking, and I mentioned, is that when you look at Catholic social teaching, you look at the church doing something that is ennobling for humanity, you know, especially when you go back and think about Rerum Novarum and what the church did right after the Industrial Revolution. So it's hard sometimes to remember to hold on to what the church does that is good and ennobling. But when you went through the list and started with Rerum Novarum, you just look and you think, yes, the Catholic Church is responsible for that. And all of its sinfulness and all of its problems, there's something, and the work of the Spirit is coming through in Catholic social teaching.
Yeah, thanks, Maria.
I think one of the things you reminded me of last week was, I was just looking at some of the notes I wrote, but if I thought about a big idea of what you discussed last week, was the change from the 19th century to the Second Vatican Council was really going from being so deductive to more inductive, which I think is much more about, human anthropology, right? We need to base our knowledge is really based in, I guess Aquinas said that, right? Everything comes to us through the senses. So it's through our experience that we really know things. And so that finally was sort of recognizing that, I think, or not that it didn't always know in some form or fashion, but that it really became something that we're teaching and talking about, and then basing writing and practice in. I think that's really important. Big change.
Yeah. Thanks, Lois. I can't remember who said it, but someone said in doing some of the reading through these documents, they found the encyclicals really boring and long. That was you, Arlene? Yeah. And Aquinas tells us that all good communication is according to the mode of the receiver. And I think that's a lesson the church has yet to learn, or certainly to actually apply. And so that's something that I'd like us to be thinking and talking more about in the 6 remaining weeks we have together, is how do we help the church do a better job of communicating this moral wisdom about what it means to be human, how to promote human flourishing and the integral development of all of creation, in a way that can be effectively received by people today. Because I think the encyclicals aren't it. I think of that line in, is it Cool Hand Luke with Paul Newman? What we have here is a failure to communicate. Yeah. There's just so much richness to these documents, but boy, are they dense. And I don't know a lot of people who have ample time on their hands to just pore over an encyclical and stay at it, because, Arlene, as you observed, they aren't exactly exciting reading.
But the thing is, when I first read them in the 60s, I thought they were the best thing since sliced bread. And maybe I myself have changed so much now that I'm saying to myself, oh my God, I can't believe this. And I'll tell you the truth, the language is very put offing, all this man. It just, I guess as I'm getting old, I just don't have the patience to go with the flow and not get bogged down on
Mhm.
something that is, you know, in a sense, it's silly, but yet I find it annoying. So, but anyway, that's neither here nor
No,
there.
Eileen, I think that's important, right? Words create worlds of meaning. And so when you're using gender exclusive language, and this is still a problem. If you look at Fratelli Tutti, there's only one woman in the entire document who's referenced, and it's Mary. At the very end of the encyclical, there are no female theologians or saints aside from Mary who are ever cited in the document. And Francis continues to rely on the gendered term fraternity, brotherhood, when I think kinship or solidarity would work just as well. And you don't have people reading over and over again just this term signifying brotherhood. And maybe some of that is a problem of language, just in translating it from Spanish or Latin or Italian to the Latin and then to the English. But these are things that I think could easily be solved by just thinking, all right, how do we use language in a way that people can see themselves represented and actually being affirmed in these documents rather than being talked about as if they aren't part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Any other lasting reflections, insights, questions, anything I can help with before we turn to the topic for tonight? I do apologize that last week we moved so quickly, and I hope that we will be able to avoid that in all of the remaining weeks. And I hope that my slides will be more cooperative going forward so that we don't have any technical difficulties. But so here we are again for week 2. And just to give you an idea of where we're headed tonight, our focus is on the dignity of the human person. So that'll be where we begin. And then I'd like to make some connections between human dignity and human rights, and then human rights to responsibilities. And although there'll be opportunities for people to chime in along the way, I certainly would like to make more room than we were able to last time to hear from your insights and questions and see what those insights and questions will spark for one another. So again, you're very welcome to make use of the chat feature here on Zoom, and to the panelists who are on screen, I hope we'll hear from you tonight in terms of what I've prepared has brought to the surface for you. Okay, so when it comes to human dignity, I think we've got to recognize that really we're starting with the foundation of Catholic social thought, that this is the absolute foundation for everything that is to follow. That when you're looking at the human person, you're seeing someone who enjoys, by virtue of their humanity, inherent, universal, and equal dignity. All life is sacred. And I always think of this line that you can see on the right hand of your screen from C.S. Lewis: next to the Blessed Sacrament, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. I think ever since I first read that line a number of years ago, it really got me to think differently about what it means to not only to recognize my own dignity, but to be on the hunt, to be vigilant, to make sure that I am recognizing the dignity of all the people that I meet. And I think an important corollary to this is that to be human is to be social, that we none of us usher our own existence into being, right? We are the product of our parents' love. Two people coming together in an act of love is the genesis of human life. And that I think it's worth noting too, that when we take seriously this idea that we're created in the image and likeness of the divine, which is what we read in the first chapter of Genesis, that we're not talking about Zeus or Dumbledore or Santa Claus or some white dude sitting on a cloud. We're talking about a triune God, a God who, as Augustine describes, is the lover, the beloved, and the love that bonds them together. So we are created in the image and likeness of a communion of love that is being offered, received, and returned. So if we're going to talk about human dignity, we have to talk about a relational anthropology, that none of us can be human all by ourselves. So just to kind of give you a real succinct approach to tonight, we have to assert very clearly that human life in every form is sacred. And it means that Catholics are called to work for the promotion of the fullness of life for all. As Jesus says, that's what he's all about in the Gospel of John. I have come so that you might have life and life in abundance. So when we want to know who God is and what God wants, we can see and hear that God is a God of life. And we have to be on the side of life and opposed to everything that is limiting or a threat to life. And that this also means that we measure our actions and policies and institutions by whether or not they're helping or harming human dignity in life. And I think, this sounds really nice. And I think, kind of in conjunction with what a couple folks were saying at the outset, it is sorely needed. I think, Lois, you were talking about this a little bit, just, these documents, although they're kind of dense, that there is a prophetic dimension here that is speaking to what it means to be human in a way that's awfully countercultural. And I really love these lines from Henry Nouwen, the Dutch Catholic priest, on the right hand here, where he says, "We are not what we do, we are not what we have, we are not what others think of us. Coming home is claiming the truth. I am a beloved child of God. We no longer need to beg permission from the world to exist." If you think about all the images and messages that we're bombarded with on a daily basis, whether it's in advertisements or in social media or anywhere else, think about all the ways that marketers are trying to feed on our insecurities, trying to convince us that we need more status, so that we need, a newer phone or a nicer car or another pair of shoes or another handbag or whatever it might be. You might recall in the 1980s, John Kavanaugh, who was a Jesuit priest and philosopher at St. Louis University, released a book called Following Christ in a Consumer Society. And it was such a success for Orbis that they reprinted, they came out with a second edition in 91 on the 10th anniversary. And then they came out with another edition in 2006 for 25th anniversary edition. And I was just teaching that book to my undergraduates last week. And boy, the commodity form that Kavanaugh describes, the way in which we are depersonalized by the consumer culture we're living in, that convinces us we have to spend our lives producing so that we can enjoy life consuming. It just becomes this kind of hedonic treadmill where we're always seeking, we're always striving, we're always working just so that we can have more stuff. And it's not only unsustainable, it is, right? If every person on the planet consumed at the rate of an American, we would need 6 planet Earth's worth of resources. So it's entirely unsustainable, but it's also just exhausting, right? Because it never allows us just to be. It never allows us or facilitates our ability to look in the mirror and like what we see. On average, women have almost 100 negative body thoughts every day. And that's not by accident. That's not a mystery. It's because of all the, photoshopped images of models that give us a completely unattainable view of what it means to be beautiful or to be socially valued. And so here, we have from the church a really countercultural vision that value, human worthiness is immeasurable. It's not something that we can quantify by how many zeros are in our bank account or where we might live or what our profession is. That it is inherent and universal and equal. That we're all equals in God's eyes, which certainly came home to me when I was in the garbage dump in the Dominican Republic, and really felt that sense of kinship with the people in the Dominican Republic and saw that their lives were just as precious as mine. And that's really what, this foundational principle of Catholic social teaching is trying to help us to see collectively. So where do we start? I think we should start in the beginning. So, if we turn to scripture, and we look at what the biblical witness is trying to tell us about who God is and what God wants and why we're here, I think if you start with that first chapter in the book of Genesis, you see that, God is creating order out of disorder, and that everything that God makes is good. And for a long time, the Catholic tradition has posited that human beings are the preeminent, the kind of the pinnacle, the cherry on top, that God saved God's best work for last when God got to the human beings that are created in God's own image and likeness at the very end. But my friends who study biology would point out that actually, if you read that story through the lens of a scientist, you see that everything had to be crafted just right so that the conditions would be appropriate for human life to flourish. That we are actually the most fragile and dependent species. And my friends who are biologists tell me that that actually Homo sapiens are the only species that you can remove from planet Earth and there wouldn't be a catastrophic result. That every other species is part of these very complex and interdependent ecosystems where species depend on other species. And we are actually, the species that are added on, not because necessarily, the world should revolve around us, in an anthropocentric view, but that we had to have the conditions just right so that human life could flourish. But I do think it's important to see that, in Genesis 1:31, God sees everything that God has made, right before God rests on the seventh day, including human beings, and sees that it is very good. And when I teach this with my students, I actually encourage them to write very good on the palm of their hand in pen, hoping that they would see that, sometime later in the day as a reminder of their own inherent goodness. Because again, I think all the images and messages that we internalize, they sow seeds of self-doubt. And we don't think that we're good enough, or that we aren't measuring up, or that we're a disappointment, or we kind of dwell on all the ways that we've fallen short of in one way or many ways. And so I think, we spend a lot of time in the Catholic Church talking about original sin, but I think it's eclipsed, unfortunately, this original goodness or the original blessing of a world that God created where everything belongs and everything is good. And that word good is important. It's not useful, it's not pretty, it's not profitable, right? Like, it is good because it exists. We can't instrumentalize that good and try to use it for some other end or some other goal or objective. And so I think this is really an important point, that the goodness is ontological. It's in its very being, and not something that we should think, well, it has to be warped around what's comfortable or convenient or expedient for our purposes, or however we might benefit from it. So when we look at this image of what it means to be created in the image and likeness of the divine, when we say imago Dei, we're not talking about physical resemblance, but we are talking about being a representative of the divine. That when you encounter another person, you're seeing an ambassador of God. That we're also internally related to God. That just by virtue of our humanity, there is an internal connection, regardless of belief or practice. And that, as God, tries to make clear in this passage I've highlighted on the screen in Deuteronomy 30, God says, I am the God of life, and I want you to choose life. And the reason why I wanted to highlight that is because we were made with free will, which, we obviously see in Genesis 3 when humans misuse free will and try to, they reject the goodness of being a creature, and they try to aspire to be more like God. And I think, a lot of us can relate to that. We kind of squirm in our finitude or in our creatureliness, rather than to see that, by virtue of the incarnation, right? Like, if being human is good enough for God, it should be good enough for us. And we should just feel totally accepted and affirmed by virtue of our humanity. So I think connecting this to the gift and task of free will is essential. Free will is a gift because we become the product of the choices we make and how we use our free will or our freedom. right? Like the things you say yes to, the things that you say no to, the encounters that you engage in, the encounters you avoid, the experiences where you try to broaden your horizons, and the ones where you kind of circle the wagons a little bit. I always think of that line, a ship in the harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. You know, we are the summation of all of the choices that we make in our life. And so freedom is that gift of self-realization, of tapping into our deepest desires and trying to bring them to fruition. But it's also a task, right? We are held accountable for the ways in which we use our freedom, or the ways that we fail to use our freedom. And so I think it's helpful for us to just kind of think about, you know, what it means to be human, to really, you know, give priority to the centrality of free will. But I think just taking a moment to see the goodness in and around us, which is hard, right? Like I think being in the pandemic, especially 22 months in, just the state of the world, all the social fragility and fracture, it's really easy to be tempted to feel overwhelmed, or to be tempted to despair, or to just throw up our hands and say, why bother caring about this? But I think the invitation here, you know, in really starting with the sanctity of human life, is to see that, you know, looking at the goodness in and around us is reason for hope. Hope not as presumption that things will be fine. You know, it's not the toxic positivity that you might have heard about, where people just say everything's fine, you know, just trying to convince themselves that they're okay, or they will be. But it's you know, the virtue of hope, that trust that there is good worth fighting for. I have to say for myself, the goodness in and around us really hit home the moment that I became a dad. I more than anything, my whole life, I wanted to be a dad. And when I found out that my wife and I were expecting our first child, it was, you know, the best day of my life, just learning that we had this nascent little life on the way. And for 9 months, I imagined this little Italian stallion growing in my wife's womb, and just couldn't wait to meet him, and expected him to come out with, like, you know, this beautiful Sicilian olive complexion and dark hair. And the little stinker was awfully stubborn, and he was 42 weeks, you know, when he first started to get the labor moving. And it was only just a couple hours before my wife was scheduled to be induced that he finally started to make his way out. And my wife was in labor for over 30 hours and was losing her strength. And my son actually got stuck on the way out, and his heart rate plummeted. And, you know, here we are in a hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My wife had intended to do everything totally naturally with midwives, no medicine whatsoever. And the midwives went to her and said, we can't do this according to the plan that we had. We have to bring in the OBGYN. And they were talking about, you know, having to cut her open to get Noah out before we lost him. And so I went from this amazing, you know, high of I can't wait to be a dad, to being absolutely terrified, because the way the doctors and nurses were talking, I was worried I was going to lose my son, and possibly, if things didn't go well, even my wife. And because Noah's heart rate had dropped so low, they started to act with a lot of urgency. And an OB took a suction cup on the top of Noah's head and started pulling on his head with the force that I think it would take to pull a whale out of the water. I mean, I thought they were going to pull Noah's head off. I was just absolutely terrified. And they're pulling on him. And finally he comes free, and his head is shaped like a cone, and he's screaming, just absolutely. I mean, his skin is just red because he's just screaming in agony. And he screamed for the first 4 months he was awake. If he was awake, it wasn't like, oh, I'm hungry, or I have a dirty diaper. It was, you know, someone is breaking my arm kind of scream. He just was in total discomfort. And so they had to rush him off to the NICU and check him out. And I'm trying to check and see how my wife is doing. And so I never got that proud papa moment to cut the umbilical cord and hold my son and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're here. And I remember when the nurses finally brought him back to the room, and they said, here's your son. I almost said, are you sure that's my son? Because he didn't look not just, he didn't look mine, he didn't even look human. I mean, just the birth was so traumatic that he looked more like an alien than he did a human being. And I felt a little bit of resistance or reluctance to hold him, just because he was nothing like I had spent the last 9 months imagining. And the nurse put him in my arms, and in a minute, in a second, I felt like the Grinch in, the 1960s version of the Grinch Who Stole Christmas, the animated version where they put the X-ray over the Grinch's heart, and he's got this teeny tiny little heart, and then he hears the Who's down in Whoville singing Christmas carols, and his heart starts to grow bigger and bigger and bigger, and it gets so big that it breaks the X-ray box. Well, that's exactly how I felt. I thought my heart was going to explode with just sheer delight, just absolute joy, and just unconditional love for this tiny, helpless, screaming alien that they allegedly told me was my son. And I had this moment, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I saw myself from above myself. I could see myself, holding this baby in this hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I had this vision that this unbridled, infinite, unconditional love and joy and delight in this tiny, helpless baby who was doing nothing to merit my love. He wasn't good looking, he wasn't well behaved, he wasn't intelligent, like he was doing nothing. But just because he was mine, that I was exploding with love for him, I had this vision that this is exactly how God feels about every human being, just infinite, unconditional love. And I think that that's really what this principle of Catholic social teaching is all about. Not just that every life is precious, or that every life is sacred, or that every person is good, but that when we look in the mirror, or when we look at the face of a friend or family member or a perfect stranger, that we are looking at someone who is loved infinitely and unconditionally by God. And it's our vocation, as Christians, to try to put that love into action by loving ourselves and loving each other. All right, let's see if my slides are going to cooperate now. Oh, come on. Let's see. Now my screen froze, darn it. Let's see. I can try this another way. All right, how about this? Instead of using Google, we'll use PowerPoint. Okay. Here we go. So I think it might be helpful just to talk a little bit briefly about what it means to be human, and the kind of this vision, this Christian vision of what it means to be human. So a theological anthropology in contrast to a cultural anthropology, where I think, culturally, a lot of people believe that their value is tied to what they're doing or what they have. And in the Christian tradition, our value, our worthiness comes just from our being. So as we've talked about before, right, we have this universal, equal, and inherent dignity by virtue of our humanity, which is true regardless of IQ or income or any capacity or orientation, that we're made to be free, and that our vocation, our calling, our purpose is to love God, ourselves, others, and all creation. And that we're made for community. For those of you who were able to spend a little bit of time with Gaudium et Spes, like I had kind of flagged at the end of our time together last time, you saw, Gaudium et Spes makes clear that the destiny of the human person, our calling, is to build up communion in the world, and that the church is meant to be this sacrament of communion, not just between each other, but between God and humanity. You may have heard the Greek term koinonia in learning about the early church, a word that we read in the Christian scriptures about those those first followers of Jesus trying to become the early church. And koinonia is typically translated as fellowship, but there are biblical scholars who argue that actually a better translation of koinonia is partnership. Not just kind of a sense of belonging or community, but being partners, and not just on a horizontal plane, but also in terms of being in partnership with the Holy Spirit. And I think that, we should take seriously, right, this triune God who is a communion of love, that, God is revealed, Christ is present, the Holy Spirit is realized, not just as community, but in community. And I've got a couple lines from scripture here that point out, that this calling to serve others, and this line from the letter to the Philippians, that we should think more highly of others and more humbly regard our own interests. So being an others-centered person is absolutely crucial to being a Christian. Obviously we're born as sexed creatures and with gender that is socially constructed. And I think what's important there, is not just, that we're, given this capacity to be co-creators with God, which is certainly what the church emphasizes, but also that there's no one way to be human, right? Like if God had wanted us to reproduce asexually, that there would have been another way to reproduce the species and propagate us into the future. But I think the fact that there is more than one sex and more than one gender is a really important reminder that there's a degree of otherness in what it means to be human, that we should reverence that otherness and not fear it, and not be threatened by it. And it's a calling to practice equality and mutuality. Like in the second story of creation in Genesis 2, we see that Eve is made from the rib of Adam, and the rib is important there because it's supposed to signify equality between the genders, not, the head or the foot where there would be clear superiority or inferiority. And so to really, see ourselves as co-equals across the otherness, across the difference. And, I think it's really important to add to that we are embodied, that we are different because of the bodies that we possess. Whether, and not just by gender, but race and ethnicity, by physical ability. I'm 6'5" and 230 pounds. I benefit from having a lot of security wherever I go. I can't really recall any time where I felt physically threatened or afraid. But I know that there are a lot of people, and a lot of women in particular, who do have to worry about their physical safety when they're out in public. And that experience of having to worry about how other people perceive you, or the way that they might take advantage of your vulnerabilities, that's going to change our experience of what it means to be human. When I was in high school, one of my really good friends was, and is still today, African American. And I remember we went to a movie one night on a Friday night, and he was driving very slowly on the way home up Lake Drive in Milwaukee, where the speed limit is 25, but no one goes 25. I usually go 40 on Lake Drive, or I did anyway, when I lived in Milwaukee. And I was giving Alex a really hard time about driving like a grandpa. And I was a little bit nervous I was going to miss curfew. And Alex made it very clear to me that in his experience being African American, if he went 26, or if he went 27, or even if he dared to go 28 on Lake Drive, he knew he was going to get pulled over by the police. And he was trying to avoid any kind of interaction with the police by going 25. And as a white male who never had to think about, my own racial identity in the way that I have these unearned benefits by my racial identity, that was a really eye-opening experience to hear what, the fear, the concern that he had for the way in which the law was being applied differently to him because of the color of the skin. And so I think it's worth pointing out here in Gaudium et Spes, this Vatican II document says every type of discrimination is to be overcome and eradicated as contrary to God's intent. I think a really bold and important statement when it was released in the 1960s. And boy, now we're living a good 60 years later. And I wonder how often the church lives up to its own standard, how many people feel discriminated by the church? People who might be divorced or remarried and who feel unwelcome to receive communion. Certainly, I think I know I've heard from a lot of widows who feel pretty invisible in the church, that they aren't often talked about by the church, or people who are single. The church really can focus a lot on married couples or couples with young children who are part of the sacramental life of the church. But how many people feel invisible in the church or feel discriminated against by the church, including especially people of color and members of the LGBTQ community? When we're talking about what it means to be human, we have to obviously acknowledge the reality of sin. So sin as, an inherited condition, which is what original sin means, that this is just part of the package deal that we inherit because of all the ways that humans have misused the gift of free will throughout time, that it is personal, right? Like you can't sin by accident. I always point out to my students, like if you accidentally eat meat on a Friday in Lent, you haven't sinned, because to sin means that you use your free will and you know what's the right thing to do and you intentionally choose not to do it. Or in the words of Jim Keenan, who was a professor of mine at Boston College, we might think of sin as a failure to bother to love. But it has to be an act of volition. It has to be, a willful decision to choose an idol instead of choosing God, or to choose to betray our own goodness or the goodness of others. And then, starting actually in the 1980s, the Catholic Church started talking about social sin in response to liberation theologians who were talking about poverty as, a structural evil. Gustavo Gutierrez, who's credited with kind of establishing the work of liberation theology, he talks about poverty as premature death in violation of the God of life, the God who desires life in abundance for all. And poverty isn't just laziness or individual irresponsibility, right? Like these are policies, they're economic choices, they're political failures. These are structural problems. And so in the 1980s, Pope John Paul II started to address sin as a social matter, which was a little bit controversial, because if sin has to be chosen, if it has to be an act of volition or will, then how do we talk about social sin if there isn't a specific actor that we would pin that sin to? But I think in the last 40 years or so, theologians have been working with church leaders to develop that idea of social sin as the beliefs and practices, the policies, the systems and structures that that normalize vice and sin, that kind of cause us to deny the goodness of our own being and the goodness of what others deserve, to threaten life or diminish it. And in the face of those real experiences of sin, of course, we have no shortage of grace. The gift of God's self. Karl Rahner's definition of grace is that which the giver and the gift are the same. And it's always everywhere present. And Aquinas tells us that grace builds on and perfects our human nature, so that even when we might look at the world and see a lot of brokenness or a lot of suffering or unjust inequalities, we can't ever, lose sight of the gift of grace that is always everywhere present, if only we pay attention to it. And that gift of grace is aimed at us to be partners with God, because God wants partners, not puppets. And so grace is the power by which we can become partners with God in trying to build up life in abundance for all. We can't escape finitude, being creatures. We are ministers, not the Messiah, as Bishop Ken Untener wrote so long ago. And that because we die, it gives life meaning. If we lived forever, then the choices we would make, the consequences of those choices ultimately wouldn't matter. So death is kind of the final handing of ourselves over to God as an act of surrender to the divine and ultimately union with God. And I think it's important to point out that Jesus' resurrection is a cosmic event that changes what it means to be human, right? Up and until the resurrection, death had the last word, and then the resurrection is the victory of God's love over the powers of sin and death. And it makes us a new creation, as Paul says in his second letter to the Corinthians, right? Not not someday, but we are already made a new creation. And the Jesuit theologian John Sobrino says, invoking this line from St. Paul, that we should live now already as risen beings, embracing this vocation to be a new creation and Christ's ambassadors of reconciliation in the world, to make new life and new union possible. So that's just kind of a sketch of what it means to be human, so that we really see this and kind of the manifold expressions of human dignity, that it's not just this static thing that, well, everyone has worth and now we're done, but to see the ways in which our bodies are dignified, right? Like we want to avoid a dualism and thinking like only our immortal souls have dignity. No, our bodies are physical manifestations of our eternal souls. And so we might think of ourselves as embodied spirits, or perhaps as inspirited souls or inspirited bodies. And to really see that, the task in front of us is to elevate, to humanize the world, and to elevate what it means to be human exactly in the here and now, and not just wait in the already, for what's next. All right, so that was really all the overview that I wanted to work through for today. And at the end of our time together last time, I asked you to take a look at Mark 10, and I hope you had a little bit of time to do that. And at the very end of Mark, the 10th chapter of Mark's Gospel, we see this particular healing story, the healing of the blind man Bartimaeus. And so I wanted to give you a chance just to sit with this story. If you didn't have a chance to give it a look during the week, I've got the entire text here on the screen. But if you did have a chance to look at it, I was interested in hearing what stood out to you about this story, or how does this story, do you think, help show Jesus as a witness to the dignity of the human person? So maybe we could hear from a couple folks.
Well, one of the things, Marcus, when I read it again and thinking about it in terms of the dignity, I thought one of the things that was clearly Jesus treating someone with dignity. He says to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" He doesn't presume. He doesn't, tell. I know he would know what's good, I suppose, right? But he doesn't say, "I've got it here. This is what you need to do. What do you want? And we're going to do this together." And that struck me this time, I guess, in a way it hadn't before.
Yeah, thank you, Lois. That's exactly why I asked everyone to take a look at this story. I think it is so powerful. Bartimaeus is blind. Of course, Jesus knows what he wants. And yet, Jesus takes the time to empower Bartimaeus to be an interlocutor, to be a partner, to be an equal, by giving him the opportunity to raise his own voice and put in his own words what is his heart's desire. And I'm sure you know, right? Like all the people that Jesus heals, these are not just considered to be outcasts, but they're considered sinners, right? That their affliction, whether it's blindness, whether it's bleeding for 12 years, whether it's leprosy, to Jesus' contemporaries, this is a punishment by God. They've done something to deserve this, or their parents did something to deserve this. So these are people who have zero social status. They are out beyond the pale. They are deemed untouchable, unworthy, right? And you can see this in the story where, Bartimaeus, it sat at the roadside begging. He's not part of the community. He's cut off. And when he cries out, it says, many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. You don't have a right to raise your voice. No one should have to hear you cry out. And I even think about this with my son screaming in pain. All I thought about was the anguish I felt in having to listen to him scream, for 4 months. But I never got to the strength, the tenderness to think, oh my gosh, this poor little baby is suffering so much. My son is now, he's 12 now and totally healthy and fine. You never know the trauma that he went through at birth. And he is the most compassionate 12-year-old I've ever met. And I have to believe it's because of how colic he was, how much he suffered, right? Like, he has a deep reservoir of compassion because he knows what it's like to suffer. And that's what I love about this story, is that, we're people who are, in the face of so many people who are willing to just write off Bartimaeus as someone who's needy or asking for something or looking to take advantage of Jesus's healing powers. Jesus doesn't see Bartimaeus as an obstacle or an interruption or a burden. And I don't know. I don't know about you, but I think we live in a world that trains people to see themselves as an obstacle or a burden or in competition, or makes people question their worthiness, right? And gets people to be filled with self-doubt. When I ask my students, how are you? And they say, fine. And I ask them, is that true? Very often, they'll eventually tell me what's going on in their life or what they're carrying. But when I ask them, why weren't you upfront about this? Almost every time they'll say, well, I didn't want to be a burden. I think we were just training people not to be authentic, not to be vulnerable, because then we just become someone else's problem. And everyone has enough on their plate. So how could I justify being someone else's problem or asking anyone to do anything more than they're already doing, because we're all stretched so thin. And all of those rationalizations and justifications just fall away because of the way Jesus treats Bartimaeus with tenderness and respect in a way that was profoundly countercultural. That to all of Jesus's contemporaries, Bartimaeus was someone who did not deserve anyone's compassion. He didn't even deserve their pity. And I really detest that word. And whenever it pops up in scripture, we should probably translate it as compassion and not pity, because pity means feeling sorry for in kind of a pejorative sense. This is an inferior person, and biblically that's not really what's going on here. The words in Greek are actually like, Jesus' heart was melting or his bowels were wrenched. This is a visceral human connection to see, Bartimaeus has been cut off. He's been told, you don't count, you don't matter, and you don't belong. And part of the healing that's happening here is not only to just alleviate him from the affliction of blindness, but it's ultimately to restore him to the community. That's really what dignity is about, showing people that we belong to each other and that there is no them, there is no outsider. And this is really what Pope Francis has been talking about in the last couple of years, about trying to aspire for an ever wider we. That's exactly what Jesus is modeling here. And I think too, it's important to point out at the bottom, the healing here is not to prove Jesus' divinity. This isn't like, oh, well, he's got to be divine because he can do this healing. Lots of people were healing in Jesus' day. What Jesus says is, your faith has saved you. In almost every instance, especially in the Gospel of Mark, when there are miracle stories, it's to show us the power of faith and to remind us of what God can make possible through that power of faith. Bartimaeus believed, just like that woman who had been bleeding for 12 years and had spent all of her money trying to be made well and was so desperate. She was made unclean and unworthy. She was a cause of great shame to her family. And out of desperation, she touches Jesus' cloak. And he's not even aware that he healed her, right? He just says, who touched me, right? And she, in that instant, she just touches his clothes and the bleeding stops and she's made whole again. And Jesus says to her, your faith has healed you, right? So I think the invitation here for us is not only to recognize the dignity of other people, especially those on the margins or those we might consider detestable or hard to love or hard to like, but to think about how we can maybe lean into the power of faith and what faith makes possible for bringing people back into community together. Any other reflections or questions that came to the surface with this passage? Mary Beth?
I just wanted to share. recently, 2 Sundays ago, I've been going to church virtually, but I talked about something like this. The priest in our parish, obviously in Brooklyn, we do have a homeless problem, and people in my parish are very conflicted on how to respond to the marginalized. And during Mass, a woman got into the center aisle and really started to have difficulty shouting out. And I have to tell you, I really witnessed a gospel moment. The priest just stopped at the offertory, came down off the altar, and embraced this woman who was really decompensating during the middle of Mass. And all of the parishioners were really bewildered how to respond. And he embraced this woman and said, "It's going to be all right." And he walked her down the center aisle to the back. And really, I have to admit, it was several women who got out of the pews and then took her from him. And he walked back and he continued Mass. And I really just had a great deal of respect. And I think that the people in the pews were more healed than this woman was, because really and truly the congregation doesn't know how to treat the people that are homeless and come into the church respectfully. And I think he was such a model for how to do this. And also, I really did have to applaud the women that were in my congregation, because they really were the ones that stepped out courageously. And one of my friends actually took an Uber and took her home to the transitional housing where she was living and had a conversation with her, because I did have a follow-up. So, it was just an outpouring of love, and it is an example in our daily lives how Catholic social teaching really is realized in, beyond just a course or a book. And I just wanted to share that, out loud. So
Yeah, thank you, Mary Beth. What a beautiful story. The Pope Francis talks about the need for a revolution of tenderness in Evangelii Gaudium. And that's, I think, what he's talking about, that kind of tenderness, which requires real strength. Tenderness is not weakness, it's fortitude. I mean, if someone's having a meltdown, if someone's screaming in your face, if someone's losing their cool, the easiest thing to do is to snap at them or to write them off or to walk away, right? But what tenderness to embrace that woman, right? Or to offer that that pledge, it will be okay, right? We are with you. You are not alone. I see you. I hear you. I care about your pain. I think Pope Francis is onto something when he calls for that revolution of tenderness, because I think if the world needs anything right now, it's the strength to be tender with ourselves and with each other. And I think that's what we see here from Jesus is, he's modeling tenderness with Bartimaeus. And that's how we're healed is by sharing tenderness with one another. And I appreciate the question of, how to treat people who are homeless, because I don't know that there's just, one answer. When Pope Francis was asked that question, what should I do when I encounter someone who's unhoused? He was said, always give them money, always. And there were people who actually work with the unhoused who said, wait a minute, not so fast, right? Like you also don't want to train people to be dependent on people's handouts, or to not make use of the mental health services or the substance abuse treatment services, or the job employment or the job training services that can be provided by shelters. Right. And so we have to hold together charity and justice. Charity is meeting the immediate need. And then justice is doing the long-term, sustainable institutional work. It's not an either or, right? It's a both and. And that's actually a perfect segue to where we're headed. So thanks, Mary Beth. So now what I'd like to do, we've got about 20 minutes left, and I just want to sketch out just a couple points here, and then we'll return to some opportunity for conversation. But to make a real clear connection here between human dignity, human rights, and responsibilities. And I think this line in particular from Pacem in Terris is really important, where Pope John the 23rd says, to claim one's rights and ignore one's duties, or only half fulfill them, is like building a house with one hand and tearing it down with the other. And I think that's so important because we can, I think, all agree on human dignity, right? And that all life is sacred. I don't think anyone's going to quibble with that. And we can then see how human dignity would correspond to certain human rights. And so in the passages that I asked you to read from Gaudium et Spes, you saw, especially in those opening paragraphs, right? Like just the litany of rights of, by virtue of our humanity, these are the rights, the right to education, the right to housing, the right to practice religious freedom, even the right to leisure and vacation, right? Like there's just this long litany of rights, which we'll get to in a second. But it's important to point out that there's two kinds of rights. There are negative rights, which kind of mean freedom from encroachment or freedom from interference or freedom from coercion, right? So like the freedom of religion is a good example of that, or the freedom of speech is a good example of that. Like I shouldn't have any undue outside influence that coerces me or compels me to either, not be able to practice my religion or muzzles me, for example. But I think in an American social context, we mostly think of rights in that way, through the lens of autonomy, don't tread on me, that kind of thinking. But that's really only one fraction of the kinds of rights that the church says are inherent in this universal, equal, and inherent human dignity. And the other kind of rights are positive rights, which require some person or institution to provide you access. And here we would think of, the right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to affordable housing, the right to education, and employment, right? Like, so that someone has to be able to provide you those goods or services so that you can have life in abundance, so that you can be free, so that you can pursue your vocation, so that you can leverage your gifts and talents, so that you can be fully human. And those positive rights require duties, social duties or responsibilities that we have to deliver on each other. So I didn't ask you to read anything from Pacem in Terris, but I thought that this would be a really good start. That we see that the promotion of life requires a well-ordered society, so that there are positive rights and negative rights, and that the only way to do that is to provide sufficient access to resources and a collective attitude of responsibility. And that's what John the 23rd is really after in this document from 1963, that you can't force people to do the right thing, right? And we know this from living through the pandemic. You can't force someone to care about anyone else, right? Like we can try to persuade them, and that's really the church's task, is to work through moral suasion, to try to reach their heart and to try to get them to tap into that goodness that's in them and the goodness in others, and to say that we really should be stewards of that innate human dignity and caretakers of one another. But when we start to coerce or cajole, or even when we try to incentivize people to do the right thing, then we're starting to constrain people's freedom. And as at least John the 23rd said, we've kind of gone astray because we started to constrain human freedom. And this is spelled out a little bit more in the two other documents. These are the two that I asked you to spend time with, Gaudium et Spes and Dignitatis Humanae. And I'm interested in hearing from you, what were the passages that stood out to you, or the ideas you found surprising or significant in those documents. And as you're thinking, I'm just going to highlight two things quickly. The first from Gaudium et Spes, that because human dignity is oriented to freedom and our vocation, which is ultimately communion with God, then every person should consider it their sacred obligation to advance social necessities for their neighbors, as in seeing themselves as artisans of a new humanity. And I love that. For those of you who were able to spend time with Gaudium et Spes, you see that it is a deeply hopeful document. It really is trying to carry forward the spirit of Vatican II and to say, all right, we've been through a world war. We're in the midst of the Cold War. You know, if you think about how unstable the 1960s were, especially when you start thinking about all the assassinations, JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and that's just in the United States. I mean, we haven't even thought about all the social change and political dysfunction and corruption and violence in the 1960s all over the globe. Still, Gaudium et Spes, you know, the joys and hopes, the griefs and sorrows of the people of this age have to be the churches. And it's a call to be artisans of a new humanity, to say we can't settle for what we just went through in World War II or in the Great Depression or in World War I. You know, that we look around at an unjust status quo and say, we can't settle for this. This is not what God had in mind for us. And what I love about that term artisan is it requires us to get our hands dirty. You know, this is very different from, you know, Arlene's reflection on how boring it is to read encyclicals. You're right, Arlene, you know, all of these paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, but ultimately it's a call to action, right? That we have to get our hands dirty. And so whenever I see the word artisan, for whatever reason, I think of either a carpenter or a potter, you know, working at a potter's wheel, you know, getting their hands dirty, doing the manual labor of trying to make something new. And so this is a creative act. And I think, you know, in a world that trains us to see ourselves as spectators or as consumers, you know, that where we only engage in places where we have a good customer experience, or we find something entertaining or that aligns with our views. This is actually saying no, and instead of just looking at what the menu of options are in front of you that are being provided by someone else, you have to think about what are the gifts and talents that you bring. How do you give those away in loving service to the world to make something new? To really, you know, to see your life as a creative act and to stretch your imagination for what's possible by using your gifts and talents and the opportunities and relationships at your fingertips. And then the reason why I asked you to spend some time with Dignitatis Humanae, although it's focused mainly on religious freedom, I thought it was really interesting for the way that it talks about the relationship between the church and the state. Because when the church talks about economics, or even maybe perhaps when it talks about religious freedom, I think you can anticipate critics who say, hey, stay in your lane. You know, you can talk about scripture, you can talk about, you know, moral choices, but don't talk to us about economics or politics or the kinds of laws that states should be passing. But that's not the approach in Catholic social teaching, right? Like, you know, when the church sees itself as an expert in humanity, it's going to see itself as a teacher to say, this is the role of government, that government should be taking care of the common good. That's a theme that we'll focus on in a couple of weeks. And so I was interested in, you know, what you thought of these passages where it, you know, Dignitatis Humanae is telling governments that they need to protect and provide for their citizens to ensure they have total freedom to practice whatever religion they choose by virtue of their conscience. Now, as Lois hinted, this is a 180 from what the church was teaching, you know, in the 19th century and in the 17th century, right? I mean, the church was 100% opposed to religious freedom because it wanted, you know, the total influence of the day. And we, you know, we go from a small band of Jesus followers, you know, to, you know, being a persecuted sect, attacked by the Roman Empire, to then becoming the official religion of the Holy Roman Empire after the conversion of Constantine in 313. And then, you know, the church takes on the actual hierarchy of the Roman Empire, makes it its own. So you see a lot of changes, you know, going from being a persecuted tiny little sect of probably about 10,000 Jesus followers after the first 100 years or so after Jesus's death and resurrection, to then, you know, just basically everyone having to be at least nominally Catholic until the Reformation. And now again, you know, a big 180 where the church is actually saying no. Freedom of religious expression is so sacred that the government has to be involved in this. So I'd like to hear from a couple of you. Was this surprising to read, or what were your reactions to the way the church is positioning the relationship between church and state, or how it understands the role of government and the kinds of laws that the government should be passing?
Well, I think clearly coming out of this is our role in, as it was said, self-giving, of our role of building society from the ground up. And so developing the family and developing within the family the ability to socialize the child, and yet with a certain amount of give and take there with society. We see it right now in our schools with the masks. Yes and no, this one wants, that one doesn't. So when we come up against these, the masks, of course, is just in some way reflective of the whole issue. But the need that we have within the church to help our families to see the importance of their role in this, of their role of socializing within the family and of strengthening individuals so that they can take their place. I mean, clearly, I forget which one of the documents I read it in, we don't coerce other people to believe what we want them to believe. We don't coerce, but we live by example, we lead by example. And I think that's a hard thing to help people to discover. First of all, their own responsibility to bring about within their family structure some kind of a conversion of individuals in a lifestyle, and then to be models.
Yeah, very well said. And a great bridge to where we'll go next week. Thank you. Yeah, who else can we hear from?
So I was reflecting on the third quote, you put it up there. In Sri Lanka, some of the kids didn't come to church because they didn't have colorful clothes. So the church came up with the idea, because the Buddhist students, when they went to their CCD classes, they wore the uniform or white garment to go to their temples. So they said everybody wear the uniform. So when they came to CCD class, nobody looked any different. So everybody came to church also. We had the children's mass. So everybody wore white clothes. And even the church, it became like anybody can wear white to come to church. So nobody felt excluded. It also trained us. Now when we go to a place, we dress minimum. So you don't crush somebody's presence with your outlooks, with your clothes. And the other thing also, when we go into a room, we always look for people's mannerisms more than their garments, what they're wearing. So you're always thinking what they talk about, how they treat others, as opposed to what they're wearing or what they're driving. So I think it was a very good way to train at such a young age what is more important, especially living in a consumerism culture right now. So it helps us to guard ourselves, in a sense, what to do and not to do.
Yeah. Yeah, that call to unity is certainly, our aspiration, and to find a balance between unity and uniformity is tricky, right? Because we have to respect the freedom of individuals and to cultivate a freedom that is not just the freedom from, it's not the don't tread on me, that vision of freedom is totally unbiblical, especially when you take seriously that line from St. Paul, that we should consider others as more important than ourselves, that we really have to have that self-sacrificial agapic love. That when we talk about freedom in a Catholic sense, it's not freedom from, it's freedom for, and that the point of freedom is self-gift. Sister Saka.
I hope I can you
Yes,
hear?
we can hear you this week. Fantastic.
Okay, great. When I heard that fulfilling your duties in community life, I want to give you an experience that I had.
Oh, terrific.
And it goes to Peru.
Oh,
In the summer, which is our winter, December, they bring together all the people to Lima. And they have and the theme when I was here one year was the dignity of the human person. And you've got all the bishops, you've got busloads of peasants, the campesinos coming, and they worked on the paper. And I can send you a copy of it because it's in Spanish, but like I said, you can certainly, the process was, the end result was the dignity of the human person, and they owned it because they were part of the community that wrote it. I think these encyclicals are good, but when you realize when you're part of the process, you can own it. And I just said it was absolutely mind-boggling, and they come every, well, winter, summer, whatever you want to say, their summer, and work on what is important for them. And it's an enmeshment of community and what it's all about. It's absolutely a heart-rendering experience to be part of this year after year.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, a great look ahead to where we'll go next week on family, community, and participation. That sense of ownership, that makes all the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Maria?
Yep. This may seem strange, but after reading the text and then listening to everything that you said tonight and the richness of Catholic social teaching when it comes to the dignity of the human person, and then especially in Dignitatis Humanae, when what the state has to do. When you look at what the church has actually said, I find it sad that most people think that the only thing that the church is concerned about is abortion, and that the issue of human dignity is about the unborn. I mean, if people really understood the richness of this treatment, of the church's treatment of human dignity, what it has to say, it would be such a liberating thing, and it would give people a much richer understanding of the church, because so many people are turned off by what they believe is the mono focus of the church on the unborn. So I just wanted to say that because there's a very rich presentation, and I can't help thinking about what a lot of people think about what is the concern of the church, abortion. And that's sad.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. You're stealing my thunder a little bit, Maria, but it's great because we're getting, no, it's perfect because we're getting short on time. But I think, for a lot of people, the pro-life movement has kind of been reduced to being, kind of a pro-fetus movement. And I don't mean fetus in a derogatory sense, right? Like, I totally honor the dignity of the unborn, 100%. Right. But I don't know that the church does enough to support mothers and those, the precious lives postpartum. And so I think to illustrate this, just to give some examples to what Maria is talking about here. On the left, you can see some illustrations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 that, if you're interested in reading more about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the process, there's a really fascinating book by Marianne Glendon called A World Made New that looks at the way Eleanor Roosevelt tried to bring together the international community after World War II to make this statement about what it means to have human dignity, and then what are the corresponding rights. And it's fascinating because, we can presume so much from kind of a Western neoliberal perspective of the human, but when you're engaging Africans who subscribe to a philosophy of Ubuntu, I am because we are, a really communitarian framework, that rights and responsibilities look totally different in an African context, or even in an Asian context, where I think in a lot of Asian contexts, not to try to generalize too unfairly, because Asia is, really diverse, as a continent, and then, in subcontinents like India, that even like the community might get more weight than the individual. And so I think this is a helpful illustration on the left, just to give people examples of what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights claimed in 1948. But what I found interesting, just in being a student of human rights, I took a seminar in human rights as part of my graduate studies, is how much Catholic social teaching helped inform the work of Eleanor Roosevelt, that this is deeply biblical, even though it was using secular language, because you had to come to a basis. What is the basis of human rights? And we'll talk about that a little bit more next time. But I also wanted to say that there are a number of people who really do take Catholic social thought seriously, and are trying to pivot a little bit away from the pro-life movement and toward this whole life movement, which I think is kind of like a regeneration of the consistent life ethic, or the seamless garment that Cardinal Bernardine popularized in the 60s and 70s, to really say that, if we are going to take seriously the dignity of every human being and life at every stage, this means, as Jim Martin has said and is quoted here, right? To be pro-life means to be pro-life at every stage, to be part of the fight for eradicating poverty, for trying to advocate for a living wage, for affordable health care, for adequate housing, for humane work conditions, equal pay for women, for generous childcare, for support of the aged and the infirm, to really take seriously the threat against life, the way in which the marginalized are rendered insignificant, or the way that they face premature death, especially the refugee and the migrant, the homeless, the person with disabilities, the single mother, women who are abused, and those who are minorities or persecuted. I think that's a really good illustration of this principle of Catholic social teaching. That certainly, yes, the church is opposed to abortion and euthanasia and capital punishment because of the ways that those deny the dignity of life at those particular stages. But it also means being pro these kinds of social policies that actually provide for access to life. Lois and Arlene, I want to make sure that we have a chance to hear from you.
I feel bad now almost that those are such lovely things to talk about before you switch this slide. But I was looking at the text and I was thinking that, kind of trying to think of this paradigm shift or what, thinking about in let's see, I think it's in number 11. Is it the right spot here? Let me see. Yeah, he talks about Jesus acknowledge the power of government and its rights, and it to the tribute, render to Caesar and render to God. And but even in all that, God has more preeminent rights in some respects about certain things, and then the civil authorities have theirs. But he and it's capitalized, so he means Jesus, refused to impose the truth by force on those who spoke against it. Not by force of blows does his rule assert its claims. So God, Jesus, is still respecting human dignity to be wrong, for us to make mistakes. And I think that we were talking about that earlier, the shift from the earlier than the Vatican time, the 19th century, when the church was opposed to these ideas, is hard for us to think about, or even to think that people wouldn't have naturally, instinctively felt compassion for Bartimaeus. That's I think, but we live in the worldview we live in, but that's hard to conceive of, that you would, but there was a time, and it's probably in the time of my great-grandparents, where people did think that a child born with a problem was because somebody did something wrong, or somebody had sinned, and so it's only a couple of generations removed, but it seems very foreign now, but it may not be as foreign as, as I guess I was thinking.
Yeah, thanks, Lois. Arlene.
Yeah, I was reading an article that was in Commonweal, and is it still muted? No, you can.
No, I can hear you.
Okay. It's called The Fallen Idol by Anthony Annette.
Oh, yeah. And his new book, Cathonomics.
I was reading that and I said, this I can understand. This really takes those encyclicals and puts them in, if you want to say, Brooklynese, for us all to understand what it really means. What is the social gospel? And then when he compares it to neoliberalism, you really realize that many Catholics really embrace neoliberalism, not necessarily the social gospels.
Right. Yeah. No, that's great. And we will talk about that in a couple of weeks when we talk about economic justice for all, which a prophetic pastoral letter by the USCCB in 1986. And you just don't hear much about it anymore, which is a shame. So we've covered this, and I know we're getting up against time, so we've got to bring this home. But just in terms of the implications and applications, how does this matter, or why does this matter? Right? It means a commitment to integral human development. So to be on the side of social, cultural, political, economic, ecological, spiritual, and moral development. If you're interested in reading more about this, Populorum Progressio from 1967 is a great encyclical where Pope Paul VI really talks about the ways in which the church is responsible for responding to this widening gap between the rich and the poor, which is, we're seeing only grow worse now than when this encyclical first came out in 67. It means practicing love, justice, and peace, as Pope Benedict XVI writes in Deus Caritas Est, that it's, again, not a choice between love or justice. I hear so many people say, love, the command is to love your neighbor as yourself. Social justice is woke garbage, or that's Marxist, or, no, justice is what love looks like in public, right? Like, you can't love your neighbor and be indifferent to their suffering because they're being deprived housing or healthcare or education. And so I think to see justice as the macro expression of love is essential, and that it's about the promotion of peace, not the absence of conflict, right? Again, going back to that biblical understanding of peace, shalom doesn't mean the absence of conflict. Shalom means the fullness of life in balance and harmony for all, so that everyone has the conditions to fully flourish. And it really, it also means prioritizing dialogue across differences. So, we're not all going to agree about politics. That's impossible. But we have to stay engaged with each other and keep dialoguing to try to better understand each other, to foster greater empathy and better appreciation for seeing the world across those differences. That's essential. And there's a whole chapter of Fratelli Tutti dedicated to practicing dialogue as an exercise of human dignity, that my neighbor, because of their dignity, their viewpoint has a validity, even if it disagrees with mine, even if it might threaten me or make me feel insecure. And I think, honestly, we do a terrible job of dialogue. I think most of the time we just wait our turn to be heard, and we don't do a great job of listening. But to go into a conversation without an agenda, without any kind of coercion or expectation, to just learn from and with one another, that's an important practice of honoring the dignity of all people, even if we disagree. And I think this line from, the synodal document in 1971 from the World Synod of Bishops is crucial. Action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as constitutive dimensions of preaching the gospel, or in other words, of the church's mission for the redemption of the human race and its liberation from every oppressive situation. So it's not an option. It's not an add-on. It is constitutive. It is essential for loving God and loving neighbor. Okay, well, we are up against time, and we got to hear from a couple of you, which was great. If you're watching this later, on YouTube or something, hopefully you press pause and do a little bit of reflection, take some notes about what, came to the surface for you, and maybe what resonates or what might challenge you or what might be unclear or unconvincing. And if you have any reflections that you want to share with me during the week, you're always welcome to email me. I did hear from a number of you since last session, and I loved hearing what was brought to the surface because of our time together. And if you're interested in doing a little bit more reading, I promise these books are way more engaging than the encyclicals. Here are 4 that I'd recommend, just so that you can kind of sink your teeth into human dignity and human rights. The one by Megan Clark, you'll see again when we talk more about solidarity. She was a couple of years ahead of me at Boston College, and she teaches at St. John. She's really, just does really important work on connecting solidarity and human rights. The book from Charlie Camosi actually won a couple awards, and he brings a consistent life ethic to a number of different social issues. And when I teach his book, students really enjoy it. And then all the way on the right here, David Hollenbach was a professor of mine at Boston College, and one of, I think, the most important theologians alive today, who really has done a lot of work on human dignity, human rights, and human responsibilities, working a lot on economic justice. He actually helped author sections of Economic Justice for All for the U.S. Catholic bishops in the 1980s. And his work with refugees, especially through Jesuit refugee service, has really been essential for him. And so his newest book, it just came out in 2019, is called Humanity in Crisis: Ethical and Religious Responses to Refugees. I think is a really practical approach to delivering on human dignity and human rights and our responsibilities to one another across borders. Okay, so here for next time, you might want to take a picture of this or do a screenshot just in case you have the time. And if you don't, that's perfectly fine. But if you're interested in maybe doing a little bit of advanced reading or thinking about, you know, how to join the conversation next week when we talk about family, community, and participation, here are the texts that I'd recommend taking a look at. Two passages from the Christian scriptures, Matthew 19 and Luke 18, to kind of see differing views on what it means to be part of family life and what the family is for as Jesus sees it. To look at Gaudium et Spes, the just 5 paragraphs there in a latter part of the document as compared to what you read for today. And then the 2 main texts on family are Familiaris Consortio, written by Pope John Paul II and released in 81. There's a lot there, but I think those paragraphs will help you maybe have a little bit more of a targeted approach to his vision of the human family as the vital cell of society in order to not just the good of the family, but to the common good. And then you may be more familiar with Pope Francis's response to the 2 synods on family and marriage and family life in 2014 and 2015 through his letter Amoris Laetitia. It's really long. I think there's well over 300 paragraphs in Amoris Laetitia. So I tried to highlight just 4 paragraphs if you have time to spend time with Amoris Laetitia, which help us to think about how we can bring mercy and accompaniment to families and from families into society. Okay, that is time for us this week. Thanks, everyone, and I look forward to being with you again next week.